I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar, and good afternoon if you're in Australia. This is the first webinar that we've done alongside Australia and Be Slavery Free, and we've been delighted at the interest in this, and look out for our program because I think we'll follow up with something in the new year. For those of you that haven't met me, I'm Colleen Theron and the founder of Ardea International. I'm a lawyer, and we've been operating for about 11 years. I can tell you a bit more about Ardea later on, but I'm absolutely delighted to welcome both Darian and Fuzz with us today, both eminent experts in this area. So let me initially introduce Darian, if I may. So Darian is the Global Director of Corporate Affairs and Sustainability and the Global Leadership Team Member for the Thai Union Group. She's the Adjunct Senior Lecturer with Integrated Sustainability Analysis at the University of Sydney. And Darian is going to provide expert insight on human rights generally, and with some reference to the seafood sector and its environmental impacts. So welcome, Darian. I'll hand over to you, and Fuzz, I'll introduce you when you're about to speak. Is that okay?
Of course.
Okay, lovely. So Darian, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Colleen and Fuzz, and welcome everyone. Nice to see someone from Melbourne on the line. So I will just share my screen. Oh, I need, Colleen, for you to stop sharing your screen, it says.
Okay.
And let's go for this one. Okay. Can everyone see my presentation?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Awesome. Well, let's go. So today I thought I would talk about environmental degradation, climate change, and modern slavery, and what those links are. And I'm taking kind of higher level perspective on this, and then Fuzz will give some real life examples that he's come across in his work. So as Colleen said, I work for Thai Union, which is one of the largest seafood processors in the world. It's a global company, not just a Thai company. I'm also a director of Be Slavery Free. So I'm on the board of Be Slavery Free with Fuzz and Carolyn Kitto. And I'm also on the board of a palm oil company. So I have a pretty broad perspective of supply chains. And indeed, supply chains is really what I like to follow. So I was really struck recently, obviously, I'm sure many of you have seen and heard this quote: "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." And this quote is from William Wilberforce in England in 1789, and it was to do with the abolition of slavery. Back then it wasn't modern, it was just old-fashioned slavery. And what I thought was really interesting was looking at a quote, and this is why it came to mind, from the California State Governor Gavin Newsom just this month when talking about bushfires, well, wildfires in California. "If you don't believe in science, I hope you believe in observed evidence. We're in the midst of a climate emergency, and I have no patience for climate change deniers." And I thought the language of the two was actually quite similar, because in both cases they are saying, what you observe, what you can see, you know that now. You may choose to look the other way. You may choose not to take action, but you cannot say that you did not know. And the wildfires, bushfires, depending on what you want to call them, it is definitely what I would consider to be a climate emergency. So the pictures that I've got here today, they're from Australia with the bushfires that happened at the end of last year, early this year. Of course, California and Oregon are on fire now. We're seeing the Arctic is on fire. So that's at the bottom left-hand part of your screen, which is incredible to think the Arctic could be on fire. The top right, we have the Amazon, which is still burning, but was particularly burning last year. And I was reading the Chernobyl exclusion zone, which is actually in the Ukraine, that has been burning since April. One of the major challenges of that, of course, any of these huge fires is a huge challenge for the people, for the wildlife, and overall for the environment. But when it's burning in a nuclear contaminated zone, the contaminated ash is actually starting to drift over Europe. And so you see not only are the local people denied access to those forests for 300 years around the Chernobyl blast, but now you're also getting the spreading of that nuclear fallout again, as you did in the first time when the actual accident happened, through the devastation and the ash that's coming from those fires. So there are definitely parallels, and whether people choose to believe them or not, now is a time for action. And I was also struck by this quote: "If slavery were a country, it would have a population of some 46 million and the gross domestic product of Angola, yet it would be the third largest emitter of CO2 in the world." And so we know that slavery is profitable. To say that it is the same profitability or the GDP of a country is quite amazing, but also the third largest emitter of CO2. And there are definite links between the two, not necessarily causal links, but in particular, you do see that where you have this rise in inequality that we're having now, we're also having a rise in CO2 emissions. And so this is from a paper that was done by Dr. Joy Murray and Dr. Aranima Malik at the University of Sydney, looking at the link between modern slavery and climate change. And I've got the reference for that paper further on. But looking, from, we'll say 2010, but the share of wealth that's being concentrated has been increasing over the past few years. And you've also got this increase in CO2 emissions. And as I said, they aren't causally linked, but what you find is that the very wealthy people can move to places with cleaner air, clean water, a better environment, and yet the people with less resources have to remain where perhaps the environment is less clean, where the impacts of climate change are more extreme. And so you do see a concentration of those impacts as wealth is concentrated. And while I was reading some of the statistics behind this, one of them really struck with me, which was that the 22 richest men in the world hold more wealth than all of the women in Africa. And that was a really stark contrast, I believe, when looking at that inequality. Now, one of the challenges that we have when looking at modern slavery versus climate change is really climate change has been discussed for a lot longer. And so you have more language and more of a framework. I'm dating myself here, but let's say 20 plus years ago, I first went to university in Australia, and it was not long after the Rio summit. Climate change was just being discussed. So you had the Brundtland Commission releasing their report on what sustainable development was. People were starting to think about what climate change could be. And as an environmental engineer, we were optimistic that this thing called climate change, we could stop it. We thought it was, man-made, that humans were making it worse. And as environmental engineers, that was really why we were being trained to use the engineering skills to try to work for the environment and rather than against it. And so come 20, 25 years later, we haven't actually beaten climate change. And in fact, most indicators would say that it's getting worse. But what we do have is more of a framework. Now, if you look on the other side, modern slavery, the frameworks have been around for probably around 90 years. Of course, going from my Wilberforce quote, the issue of fighting slavery has been around for many centuries. But we don't have the same framework for fighting modern slavery at the moment as we do for climate change. So, for example, with climate change, we have the Paris Agreement. So that's where multiple countries have signed up to reduce their emissions within a certain bandwidth, and people understand the language, the direction, and the reason for the commitment. But there's no equivalent, global equivalent, setting binding targets for modern slavery. Then you have the guidelines for greenhouse gas inventories, and whether you're doing that at a country level or a company level, it's still an important aspect of how you manage greenhouse gas emissions, which of course has a knock-on effect as part of climate change, but you don't have such guidelines for inventories for modern slavery. Now we're starting to develop these, but it is not quite as clear-cut. Carbon footprinting has been used for years, and indeed integrated sustainability analysis, the area where Dr. Joy Murray and Dr. Aranina Malik are based and studying from. That school does quite a bit of carbon footprinting. When I did my PhD at that school, we were starting to look at slavery footprints and social footprints, but that's still very much emergent. And we haven't really decided how we can utilize that either at a government, a civil society level, or a business level. Now you find there's a common language with climate change. So the example given in this paper is that if you see school students protesting around the world, so Greta Thunberg, was remarkable in getting all of this action from the youth and from school children around the world, you'll see things like CO2, renewable energy, fossil fuels, global warming. But the language really does vary on modern slavery. And if you are in, say, the US, a lot of focus is on forced labor. From Australia, it could be trafficking in persons, or slavery. It could be looking at forced marriage, forced labor, debt bondage, the worst forms of child labor, deceptive recruiting, people smuggling. There are so many different components that make this up. And indeed, I've been involved in discussions about whether modern slavery is the umbrella term and everything else falls underneath, or modern slavery is part of this definition and forced labor is in fact over the top. And so not having that same common language, I think, sometimes holds us back. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, hugely influential, made up of well-respected scientists from around the world. They issue advice for governments. Everybody can get this advice. It is based on science and very clearly stated. But again, we don't have the equivalent for modern slavery. And there's really a lack of global leadership. So you'll have companies who are now putting out statements around how they are going to meet their emissions targets, become climate neutral, but you don't see the same level of commitment on modern slavery. And part of it, actually working on this, I can say, is because it's difficult to know what that commitment should be, because there's so much complexity involved. Now, why is climate linked to modern slavery? I mean, one of the biggest risks is the change in the environment where people are living. So whether it's extreme weather, we've all seen tsunamis, floods, fires, that has a definite impact on the environment where people are living. Drought and lack of water, you're going to see mass migration starting to happen due to lack of water. Price fluctuations in crops, can people maintain a livelihood with crops, particularly in areas where there is a lack of water or extreme weather events? Lack of access to native land, as we're seeing with massive land clearing issues, the destruction of villages, pollution, rising sea levels. All of these factors are contributing to climate migrants who are on the move and will look for shelter and work in other countries. But just in that process of being a migrant, and if you look on, say, the International Organization for Migration, for example, you see that when people are migrating, they are at a very high risk point, higher than other populations, of exploitation and modern slavery, in particular of human trafficking, debt bondage, forced and child labor. And so you really do start to see these direct links between the state of the environment and between humans, human health, and human rights. And I've just included a small map from UNODC, which is about migrant smuggling in Southeast Asia. And I thought it was interesting here, so I'll go through some of the points. The risks facing smuggled migrants, that they're vulnerable to trafficking, which we've already discussed. But in one of these points here, it specifically says that political and environmental circumstances, do play quite a role in this. So now I'll just briefly talk about Thai Union, and Thailand. In 2014, The Guardian wrote an article, and you can see some of that article down here on the bottom right, about slavery and human trafficking in the Thai seafood sector. And specifically what they were writing about was what they called ghost ships. So people were being trafficked onto these ships. They were being forced to fish, and that fish was being sent into Thailand, where it's processed into fish meal. The fish meal was being fed to shrimp or prawns in aquaculture, and then that product was being processed and sent around the world. And that was really a wake-up call for both the Thai seafood sector, but also the rest of the world. I know I was working with WWF at the time, and that was a huge story. It was something that we were all discussing. Now, a lot of the discussions were around slavery, modern slavery. So you can see the AP story on slave-peeled shrimp, the global Greenpeace campaign that resulted from the work that was happening in Thailand. A lot of that focused on human rights and abuses at sea. Ian Obina was writing about sea slaves. So a huge issue. And there were lots of other things happening. So you had the European Union issuing what was called a yellow card for IUU fishing, illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, which was saying, that's not my phone, somebody's phone. Maybe if you can mute your telephone, thank you. That was saying that the fishing regulations weren't being trusted. You had international media investigating, particularly around human trafficking and slavery. You had lawsuits on forced labor and human trafficking from the US on companies that were working with Thailand on seafood. As I mentioned, there was a global Greenpeace campaign. There were angry customers that their businesses were being threatened by risks that were being highlighted in Thailand. You had a government in transition, and so what you had was there'd been a coup in 2014, and so a military government was in place, and you couldn't have the US and European Union in particular had suspended diplomatic ties, and so trade was one of the only ways they could influence what was happening in Thailand. The US Trafficking in Persons report rated Thailand at a tier 3, and then you had very active NGOs. Now, a huge amount of this was about, forward too quickly, was about the modern slavery aspects. But actually, if you dig deeper, why did the modern slavery aspects come about? And a large part of that cause was due to the environment. So Thailand, for most of history, has it's surrounded by water. You've got the Gulf of Thailand and the Andaman Sea, blessed with a lot of water on land as well. And so fishing and seafood was a big part of that culture. As global markets opened up, Thailand began to export more seafood to the world. But what you found was that the stock of the fish in the Gulf of Thailand and the Andaman Sea started to decrease. So whereas previously, say, a fishing vessel could go out for a week or two, they could catch enough fish that all of the fishers on board and the captain could take a share in that profit, go and live for, let's say, another month before they needed to go back out to sea again. As the number of fish in the oceans decreased, they needed to put more effort into catching that fish. And when you combine it with rising water temperatures, so the Gulf of Thailand has really increased in temperature, you also combine it with pollution, be that plastic or other kinds of petrochemicals, then you have a massive decline in fish species. More effort was required to catch fewer fish, and that's when people started to get trafficked into the industry because it wasn't anywhere near as profitable, and in fact barely profitable at all. So underlying all of these issues that I'm talking about, which are framed within modern slavery, human trafficking terms, actually it's environmental degradation that was driving that change. And I will pause there and hand over to Fuzz to go into more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Darian. Thank you, Darian. And Fuzz, just an introduction to you. Thank you for joining us today. So Fuzz, I've known for a long time. Fuzz Kitto is the co-director of Be Slavery Free. He's the co-director of Spirited Consulting. And I know Fuzz has worked in the cocoa industry for a very long time, and you know, increasingly also around tea. If I remember, a lot of work you've done in Assam, Fuzz. So we're very much looking forward to your discussion today, particularly with the focus of your experience and in cocoa, of this link between modern slavery and environment. Hand over to you.
Well, thanks, Colleen, and thank you, Darian. As we've worked together with Darian for so many years now, and with Colleen for even longer, and Darian's on the board, our board now as well, which we're much humbled by because of her experience, and particularly what she's been able to do at Thai Union. We so need heroes, and as she will say, they're not completely there yet, but they're in the process. And I think that's the important one. Inertia is the hardest thing in this area. So what's the link between modern slavery and the environment and climate change? Well, slavery and climate change are global, and primarily they are transnational, apart from perhaps in India, when it's much more internal that's happening there. And we see that it's both global and local. What we did not expect when we saw the rise of globalism was the rise of localism. And that became a really interesting one for us to deal with when it comes to slavery and when it comes to this whole area of global changes that we're seeing in the environment and in global warming, climate change, particularly there. So slavery is global, a term that some of you might be used to, and that is the connection of local to local. So with the global, it's looking at the whole impact of what's happening around. Global is looking at comparison between local community and local community. And people are enslaved from a community to a community. And that's a very, very important one, we think, for us to understand what do we do about this connection, or what do we do about slavery and about climate change as well. Now, the interesting part when we look at what's happening around the world and we look at this connection between global and local, what we start to see is an incredible change that's happening. And one of the things that I often say is that when it comes to slavery, the trade is in people, but the currency is hope. Now, in climate change, the currency is also hope. Hope is a driving force for us as human beings, and both slavery and the climate change are people-oriented. They affect people, and it's important to see that connection together. Now, we've done chocolate reports for a number of years now, both on what chocolate companies are doing, and what do we look for in trying to be good consumers. And we started out by saying, well, yep, go for the certifiers, Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, UTZ, UTZ, and of course Rainforest Alliance and UTZ have now merged together. And people started to ask us, well, what's the best? You know, and so we started to do reports on that called A Matter of Taste, looking at the programs that came out of certification. Then we added the 5 biggest chocolate companies in the world that produce 80% of the world's chocolate. And then we realized that there was another group called the processors, who generally, apart from Lindt, who go from bean to bar, the other 5 go from well, they get their cocoa liquor or cocoa butter off a processor who has roasted the nibs and produces cocoa butter and cocoa liquor or cocoa powder. But they buy off co-ops who get their cocoa off the farmers. And so we started to do an analysis of the cocoa programs that the chocolate companies started to do, because they realized, first of all, that child labor was a major one. In 2001, the Harkin and Engel in Congress and the Senate in the US tried to push through a piece of legislation that said the US would not import any chocolate that had slavery in its supply chain. that got overturned because the people from the chocolate companies, the lobbyists, went ballistic. Said, we do not need a law. We don't need a law from this. We can handle it. We can self-regulate. And we see what happened there in self-regulation, as happens far too often, not all the time, but far too often, that it's a long process. They said we can do it by 2004. By 2004, they said this is more complex than we thought. Now, if we had money for every time we'd heard that statement, we'd be an incredibly well-resourced NGO by now. But what we're seeing is the rise now, and I'll come to this in a tick, of this correlation between finances, self-regulation, and progress. But then they started to realize that the environment were also major factors in looking at what was happening in the production of cocoa. Now, about 70% of the world's cocoa is grown in West Africa. And that's where we started to see some of the greatest human rights abuses and the great degradation. From 1960 to 2017 in Côte d'Ivoire, for instance, it's got from 12 million hectares of virgin forest and jungles to now 3 million. They have had about 80% degradation of their environment, and it is affecting their climate in what's happening. Now, we started to realize as we started to have the focus on slavery, because that's our primary one, being slavery free, that the environment was so closely attuned that you had to do it. And so we now work with Green America, Mighty Earth, and also in Kitto in Germany, Be Slavery Free in Holland. And we do a chocolate scorecard. We did one at Easter, and we looked not only at the human rights abuses, but we also started to look at deforestation, agroforestry, and the use of very destructive chemicals, often by the young people who are involved with child labor with this as well. So we saw the importance of the correlation between the two, and the importance of forming coalitions to try and tackle this together, both in the climate change and the slavery. Now, what we've seen is that there are many factors that are emerging in connecting slavery and climate change, but three key ones that I think are these ones. First, the declining capacity of agrarian economies and cultures that really live off the land and are dependent upon that for their livelihood or for their food, are finding that with climate change, there is an inability to actually produce the food that is needed to be able to feed the families. Côte d'Ivoire, average size of a family is 7 children and 2 adults, and 6 children and 2 adults in neighboring Ghana, which is the second biggest producer of cocoa. And they just were not able to sustain what was needed for them to be able to do that. The other connection that we started to see was between the global supply chains that had a dissociation between the primary producers, the processors, the manufacturers, and the retailers. Consumers are giving very little information or knowledge about what's happening in the environment in the places where cocoa is grown, and particularly in West Africa, and also that there is slavery practices in the supply chain. So in other words, with globalism and with elongated supply chains, there is a disconnect between where the primary product was grown and the consumers buying it. And so they were able to hide what was happening there, and both were being hidden in supply chains. And that's why Dr. Darian and we believe that supply chains is a major, major area for us to make a difference in these two areas. The third thing is that it's the same mindset come culture that affects the destruction of the environment and the use of slavery. A lack of values, accountability, long-term thinking, and particularly attitudes. How do we make more money faster and get away with it? And this is not just all to do with greed, it's often to do with poverty. And the greatest driver of environmental destruction, and particularly in slavery, is poverty. And so what we see is that there is a cultural mindset. Now, Kevin Bales has written a extremely good book on seeing the correlation between the two, and he comes to the conclusion that the best way for us to, in fact, deal with global climate change is to look at slavery, because it's a greater connect, and because they're so intertwined, you can deal with it because you're dealing with the same mindset. Now, this research paper that Darian was also quoting, which is an exceptionally good one out of the University of Nottingham, Royal Holloway Universities, and the Independent Anti-Slavery Commission in the UK, came up with this chart, which I find a really, really helpful one in looking at how do we see this connect happening with climate change and with modern slavery, that we see that there are social, institutional, political, economic factors that come in that often use slavery, as Darian was saying, which has caused climate change. And we've seen that the absolute majority is estimated up to 80% of the deforestation is done by slave labor. When we see that in the environmental destruction, that there is illegal logging, there is the cocoa production in West Africa, and what we see is an increased vulnerability to slavery coming out of those things which have such a destructive area and effect on the environment. The other thing is that we think that there are key steps, but the connections happen, and often best told through stories. Tui was from Myanmar. His family noticed that the production of the rice was going down due to climate change and realized they did not know how to grow rice in any other way. They worked together, of course, as extended family, and tried to work out what could they do. Well, they didn't know they would have to experiment, but they didn't have time to do that. So they needed some other income. So they thought the best way would be to put their money together, get one of them to go to next door to Thailand to get a job, and to be able to send money back to sustain them in the meantime. And so they raised all the money they had. It was not enough. They had to borrow. He went across to Thailand and was told he had to pay more money, which he didn't have. And so because he didn't have the money, said, well, you owe us all this money. So you've got to go into whatever job that I give you. And was trafficked into a fishing boat that was there. And he never stepped on the land for 17 years. So the connection is happening a lot of ways like this. The other one that I'd tell you about is Saleh. And Saleh was from Burkina Faso, and most of the boys trafficked into Côte d'Ivoire, into the cocoa industry as boy slaves, child laborers, from Burkina Faso, Mali, and the countries around, unstable, and where there is massive degradation due to climate change is happening there. Saleh, a father, really struggled to get enough out of the farm. It basically wore him out, and he died very early, leaving his wife with 6 children. And she didn't know what to do. So a neighbor said, look, I can get him a job if it would be helpful in Côte d'Ivoire. She said, oh, but he's only 12 years of age. Yes, well, that's up to you. I'll have to talk to him. She talked to him. He, being the eldest, realized he had an obligation there. So the neighbor came to this labor agent. He was then trafficked to Ghana, then across the border. It's a soft border, easy to get across into Côte d'Ivoire, and was trafficked right across to the other side of the country, to the undeveloped areas close to the Liberian border. And so it was there that they started to get this sense of trying to understand where he was. He had no idea where he was coming from. He had no idea what was happening. He had no idea what was sort of happening to him. And eventually he got found. But in the process, the farmer realized that next to them were reserves that they were not allowed to go on to, but no one was around to see what was happening. So he started to get these boys to cut down the forests and to cut down the trees and to start to plant cocoa trees there, which expanded out that probably about 30 to 40% of the cocoa grown in Cote d'Ivoire is what's called unorganized. It's not a part of the system, and most times it is illegally done. These people come often out of incredible poverty, and so they see this as the great hope that they can get some money, they can maybe send back home, they may have a better life for them and their families. And so eventually Soleil was found. It took ages to find how to get back. When he got back, he found out that his mother and the children could no longer live on the farm because there is not enough that was happening there to be able to produce the food. And so they were kicked off the land. And so there are a number of key steps, we think, in dealing with both slavery and the whole factors of climate change and as well. One is do a risk assessment. I often quote Darian here where she says, how do you find it? Well, look for it. If you don't look for it, you're not going to find it. So one of the key things is to do a risk assessment, and there are a number of companies and tools which are being developed. Darian mentioned before the supply chain school at Sydney University. They have on their computer all the trade routes in the world, and so they're able to cross-reference those with where we know there has been reporting of slavery, and they can dig down to tier 8 to tier 10 in a risk assessment. The second big area, which is really, really important, is to get to understand that there's got to be a traceability and transparency of where goods are coming from. What's happening in their production, what's like an environment there, and for companies to be transparent about showing where their products come from and what they're doing to be involved in doing something about both the environmental factors and destruction as well as slavery in those areas. The third one is we've got to be working towards a living income wages and economic development. The imbalance that Darian was talking about is something we just got to deal with. We will not see a change happening in both the environmental issues and in slavery until we start to get some economic development in these countries where they're so desperately poor that they will put themselves in vulnerable positions to be able to either take what they can and will destroy what they can just to survive, or to get jobs, and so they're so vulnerable to slavery. And the other key one is mandatory due diligence. Now, EU is looking a lot at this. A number of countries and regions around the world are saying, look, do we need to have not just voluntary ways into doing this, but we need to have laws which back this up. Now, laws, as Colleen will tell you, laws reflect the values of a society and a culture. And so it really is, what do we believe in as countries? What do we believe in as cultures? What do we believe in as places that we embed in the laws that actually helps to make it happen and makes it something which is so key. But we need to be working on this together, and that's the really important one. And I'll finish with this story. There was a farmer who grew excellent quality wheat in every season. He won the award for the best grown in the county. One year, a reporter from the local newspaper interviewed the farmer and learned that each spring the man shared his seed, his best seed, with his neighbours so that they too could plant it in their fields. How can you afford to share your best wheat seed with your neighbours when they're entering their crops into the competition as well as yours? Why, that's very simple, said the farmer. The wind picks up pollen from the developing wheat and carries it from field to field. If my neighbours grew inferior wheat, cross-pollination would steadily degrade the quality of the wheat, including mine. If I am to grow good wheat, I must help my neighbours grow good wheat as well. And the reporter realised that the farmer's expectation also applied to people's lives in the most fundamental way, in communities as well as societies. Those who want to live meaningfully and well must help enrich the lives of others, for the value of a life measured by the lives is measured by the lives that it touches, and those who choose to be happy must help others find happiness, for the well-being of each other is bound up in the well-being of all. And that's why we think collaboration in this is absolutely key for us to be able to work for the well-being not only of ourselves, our company, our business, our community, our country, but globally. How do we do this? It's going to be the only way that we actually can solve this, which is together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fuzz. That was incredibly insightful and I think very helpful in terms of leading into what I wanted to just very briefly share on. So that means if I can actually get my slides back up. Have you stopped sharing?
Yep.
Sorry about this. Don't know where my slides have gone. Right. It worked earlier. Just don't know where they are now. Sorry guys. There we are. Can you see that? Can you see that?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I don't know why my don't know where my slides have gone. So that's not very helpful. Can you see me at all? Now I've gone off the whole screen.
We can see you.
You can see me, but not my slides. Okay, let's try one more time. I'm really sorry. I don't know what's happened to my slides. Maybe what I'll just do is try and speak briefly, because we only have 10 minutes. I mean, the irony is that both Darian and Fuzz shared their slides with me to ensure that if there was a crisis, we would at least be able to see them. And now for some reason, it looks like mine have disappeared. Let me just see if I can try one more time to...
Have you clicked on your presentation and then click share?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to try and do now. So if I share screen, it's just, I think what's happening is it's not allowing me to share the screen for some reason. I don't know why. It's not happened to me before. Can you see it? What's, oh God. I wonder if is there anything I can be doing differently to share the screen?
Not really. Have you've pushed share screen, and if you come up to see what screens are open,
can you see now? Sorry.
Now we can see.
No, now I've wasted all this time. So I just think that there's only 3 points really that I'm going to try and make on the back of these very erudite conversations and sharing. And I think extremely helpful, having heard what Darian said on the global picture, and also particularly Fuzz around, you know, the experience in cocoa and the kind of steps that we can be thinking about taking as a global community, and perhaps also locally. And I think that the two sort of the points I probably want to just raise in our discussion today in bringing in the overlay of the legal piece is that, first of all, of course, we've seen how COVID and the coronavirus pandemic has really escalated all these issues that we're talking about. The vulnerability of people is increasing exponentially. And of course, that the pollution issues, the environmental issues, I think, are not perhaps even being addressed to the extent that I thought they might be, particularly around things like disposal of PPE. I mean, we are all now being asked to wear masks. We have disposable gloves. Where are those things going to? I don't see a conversation around that happening. And I think that that is something that in the broader picture we need to consider. So sort of drawing on what both Fuzz and Darian said, it is the issue of climate change and human rights is very connected, although from a formal point of view, it hasn't always been spoken and acknowledged. I mean, it was only a few years ago that the UN appointed a special rapporteur to look at the link between environment and human rights. From a legal perspective, we see that human rights are protected through rights of life, through the EU Convention on Human Rights, through the global conventions on human rights, but there's not, in many areas, there is not actually a protection or access to a right to the environment, which you can hold a claim on. And that, but those but the connections are there, and we see that to have a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment is really integral to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights. So I suspect that in the years to come we will see increasingly litigation around these issues. But I think the really key point that was made by Fuzz in his presentation is that we have for years relied on self-regulation by companies, CSR policies, fair trade. I'm not saying that fair trade isn't necessary, but it's part of the voluntary framework. The UN guiding principles, 2011, all extremely valuable voluntary principles, but they are voluntary now, nonetheless. And what has begun to happen is that we've seen an increase since the 1960s on mandatory reporting requirements. Now, the mandatory reporting requirements will specify to some degree what is required around reporting on the steps that companies are taking in addressing either human rights issues or environmental issues. And this growing body of legislation is beginning to reference due diligence. And we see it in both environmental regulations around conflict minerals, timber regulations. The EU Non-Financial Reporting Directive covers both environmental regulations as well as human rights regulations. But the critical thing for businesses is now to consider due diligence that may well become mandatory. The EU, as you know, has made a statement in April saying that by 2021, mandatory due diligence legislation will be introduced. What is critical around this discussion is that it is not just being supported by NGOs, but it is actually having investors and companies that are sitting behind this push. And the reason that I think many corporates and investors are getting behind it is very much the acknowledgement that self-regulation is just not enough. And there isn't a level playing field for business. So for those companies that actually have considered the impact to their business, both from a reputational point of view, from a resilience point of view, they will have put resources and time and energy into understanding their supply chains and looking at ways that they map their risk and actually act on what they find. But for those businesses that still chase price, that cut corners, there is not a level playing field. And it is possibly only by the introduction of law, but law with penalties, that we might see a difference. And I think Fuzz also alluded to this, is the point that we need a cultural change in business as well. And sometimes it is the introduction of that law that starts the cultural change. Now, the Modern Slavery Act, which is really about transparency for businesses to disclose the steps they're taking to address modern slavery in their supply chains. I've referenced the UK Act, but of course we have an Australian Act now and potentially a New South Wales Act that is going to be asking businesses to report on what they're doing. Now, this local legislation, one of the critique that constantly comes to the fore is that there are not penalties. And so whilst directors are getting involved because they have to sign these statements, there may not be the same kind of commitment to how these issues are addressed in comparative to, say, bribery legislation or GDPR legislation or gender pay legislation, because for the most part, all those other pieces of legislation will have penalties around director liability, around fines and enforcement, which currently under slavery legislation, human rights legislation, we don't have. And I think that just then lends itself to perhaps not taking these issues as seriously. I don't really have time to go and look at some of the voluntary initiatives. The only other point I wanted to raise to just allow for some questions, and certainly if someone's interested, we can share some of our slides depending on if Fuzz and Darian are happy to do that, is we wrote a guide about managing compliance with environmental law and human rights law for IEMA in 2018. I think what was really interesting around this piece of work was the workshops that we ran prior to drafting and publishing this piece of work, about trying to understand what the barriers were for companies in addressing these issues in a connected way. And of course, the key and critical issue that kept coming to the fore in both these workshops and what I see consistently in business is that there is still a silo mentality. And really, for us to start connecting environment and human rights risk, we have to break down these silos. There is a necessity to integrate thinking. That's not always going to be just simplistic to do. I understand that when you undertake environmental due diligence, there is a different way of looking at things compared to how you might do human rights due diligence. But the critical issue is, in each instance, as both Darian and Fuzz has alluded to, is knowing your risk, being able to identify these things, connecting people who are working on these issues together to talk about how they see the trends of how things affect them, and very critically, how these things are fed into board structure, into the governance requirements, into what investors might need as well in terms of information around these issues. Again, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals are pushing some of the integrated thinking, not perhaps as broadly as we might have hoped, but certainly they are there as a reference point for businesses to consider how they might address these issues. I haven't actually put out a number of steps of what businesses can do. Certainly we could share that in a blog. I might do that after this, but I think just to sort of draw together what both Darian and Fuzz has said, and perhaps from our point of view, is, you know, the critical place is to start by knowing what you have in place. So from a compliance perspective, understand the law. It sounds really arbitrary. The number of organizations that I work with that don't actually understand their own domestic legislation and what's required of them is quite insightful. So I would say compliance, understanding that is critical, but that's just the benchmark. One has to really go beyond that. It is about understanding your risks, mapping your supply chain, getting the resources right within your business. You know, who is being tasked to do this? Are they equipped? Do they have the right skills? Is there the right kind of training that has been put in place? What is that training? Is it specific to the needs of particular people within the business? And that's what we're seeing increasingly. You know, providing training that's just basic awareness is a starting point, but critically, boards need to understand why these issues are important. Managers need to understand where this affects their role. And so I know that there are a lot of different opportunities for businesses to go and look for things. We have lots of training that's available, and just refer to our website to look at that. And I know that we are now almost up in terms of time, but if any of you have a question, could you please just put it through into the chat or into the question side? We'd love to hear from you, and, you know, any reflections on what we've discussed today would be well received. So I'll just give everyone a minute perhaps for a question to be raised. Perhaps just stop share at this point. Perhaps while we're just waiting for some questions to come in, Darian, maybe I can just ask you a question just out of interest from what you've said. So interesting. Can I ask you what or how you have raised these issues at a board level to really get them to understand, you know, what's going on?
So I was fortunate at Thai Union that when I joined, they had already decided, so this was back in 2014, that they wanted sustainability to be a key differentiating pillar of the business. And so when I was hired, it was to report directly to the CEO, and obviously he reports into the board. When issues have arisen, then because of that mindset that sustainability is a core part of our business, it actually makes it much easier to raise the issues and to get engagement. And I would also say that Thai Union, although now a listed company, is a family company. It was started by 3 brothers who migrated from China to Thailand. So they themselves were migrant workers at one stage. And so particularly on issues around modern slavery, when they're raised, it is dealt with also on a moral perspective. It isn't always just straight out, well, what is the business case? The business case is important, of course, but there is also a moral dimension. And so there's always an opportunity to raise these issues and say, we think this is the right way to be, and also that we're showing leadership amongst the industry. And I think Fuzz's example was a great one about the farmer with the wheat, that actually it doesn't work just to have one good company in a sea of companies who aren't really changing their practices. You need to influence a whole industry.
Thanks, Darian. That's really insightful. And Fuzz, I wonder if you want to just come in on that. As you know, we've spoken, I know, for a number of times around corporate culture. Do you want to perhaps just share a view on, you know, what we mean by changing corporate culture, and how companies can embrace change in that area?
We could do a whole webinar, a whole series on this one, Colleen, because I think it's a crucially important one. But let me say that I think that's got to be seen in the context of the things that Darian was saying there at the end. We talk about a shared responsibility, and we think there are 5 sectors that have got to work together on this. And we do think that sectorial cooperation and collaboration is key to all this happening. And we started to see it happen in a number of sectors, and the chocolate sector has started to work together. It wasn't until 2012 they all came together in the World Cocoa Conference, and they started to then influence each other, and there was a race to the top. It was an interesting race in that they did not talk to each other, but what they did form was an association of the Chocolate Action collaboration of a whole number of processes and companies who tried to work together. And I remember one of the head of sustainability of one of the biggest chocolate company in the world said to me, look, Fuzz, I came back from this Cocoa Action Coalition meeting, and I said, we're going to be working with others on this, and the staff just stared at me and said, aren't they our competition? And she said, I then realized we're having to go through a real culture change. We are so used to competing for the market that if we're going to all win this, if we're going to all win out of this, we've got to work together and raise the bar to actually understand what's the benchmarking on this, what's best practice in this. And I think that's one of the first things. We have a company in Australia, which we often talk about, who went through this culture change as Konica Minolta. They do printers and photocopiers. And of course, there's a massive decline in that industry because of digitalization and a lot of personal printers that people now have at their desk. And and it happened because David Cook, who was the national managing director. Now they don't produce the photocopiers; they actually sell them. And so he was on a conference, one of their conferences in Southeast Asia, and saw firsthand slavery and came back and thought, I've got to do something about this. I cannot just sort of allow this to happen. So they went through a whole process of saying, like Thai Union did, sustainability is going to be a key value, and they started to move that and push that. Now, when they come to a sale pitch and they've realized that the business model of raising this and working sustainably in they raise the profile and their value of sustainability is so strong, The sales pitch now is, oh, by the way, we want to tell you what Konica Minolta in Australia is doing when it comes to checking our supply chain. These are the values we have. These are the tools which we're sharing with other companies, anybody who wants to use them on our website. We are really making difference in people's lives. And by the way, we make really good printers and photocopiers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the change that happened, which is a major culture change in the ways that I think companies can do it. We've seen this starting to happen so well, and Darian has led this entire union in a very vulnerable industry. And I think it is really going, we're working with a major construction company where they said, look, we're way behind on this. And we went back to our history, and one of the founding values that we had as a company was looking after our workers and those who supply us. And we just realized we've got away from our primary values that happen here. So I think understanding our values, what are we doing here, but also what does it mean to be a good business? But as we've seen this last week with Rio Tinto, when they did a major destruction of an Aboriginal site, the investors went up in arms, and the CEO and senior management have all resigned because of the pressure of the investors. So I think that investors are a major force within this, as well as the leadership, as well as how do you embed this in every member of or staff that you have, that this is who we are, this is what we do, because we really believe that people are important and the environment's important.
Great, thank you. We've suddenly had a plethora of questions come through, and I'm just conscious of the time. How do you feel about if we answer perhaps one of them and then perhaps try and capture these questions and send out the answers afterwards? How are you doing time-wise, Darian and Fuzz?
I have another meeting that I need to go to, unfortunately.
So I think we've had 3 interesting questions. I'll try and capture these now. If I can share them with the panelists after this, and then actually send it across to as an answer to everyone. Would that be okay with the 2 of you?
Sure.
That's fine.
Is that all right? I must just try and take a picture quickly and not lose them. So, Darian and Fuzz, all I want to say is thank you very, very much for giving up your time today. I thought both your insights were invaluable. I'd like to spend some time digesting what has been said. I think for many of the people who are listening today and looking at some of the questions, that seems to be some of the thoughts as well, looking at how to really really think about ways that they can address these issues together to change businesses, and then some questions that have come in around overcoming the pandemic. So I'll send you the questions. We'll answer these perhaps through the website. I think that might be the easiest way to do that and there will be a recording of the session. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a lovely day, both of you, or evening, while we head into our day.
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, Fuzz. Thanks everyone
so much for your time. Take care, you two. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye then. Bye. Bye.